Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hamira Osman, and on behalf of Muscular Dystrophy Canada, I'm very happy to welcome you to day 3 of our virtual neuromuscular conference. For those that were part of our virtual roundtable, welcome back. Before I start with introductions, I wanted to share that today's webinar is available in English and in French. So on your screen, you will see a globe icon. You can go ahead and select English if you'd like to hear today's presentation in English or French. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Marie-Hélène. I believe she's on the call as well, who will be able to share this instruction in French. Go ahead, Marie.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde et merci d'être là aujourd'hui pour cette deuxième conférence de notre troisième journée du colloque. Alors, je voudrais vous informer que la conférence est disponible dans les 2 langues. Je vous inviterai à aller cliquer sur l'icône que vous voyez dans le bas de votre écran en forme de globe terrestre et de choisir la langue de votre choix. De cette façon-là, vous pourrez entendre la conférence dans cette langue-là. Alors, merci beaucoup et bonne conférence.
Thank you very much, Marie-Hélène. Next, we have Marie Benedetti and Kathy Natton, both from the Hospital for Sick Children, where they are medical social workers and work on the complex care team. We're so excited to have them here today to talk to us about parental stress, parenting, and the chronic illness experience. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can share your slides today, Mary.
All right, I wonder if that worked. Thank you for inviting us here and having us talk. I'm Mary.
And I'm Kathy Netton. It is such a privilege to be meeting with you today, and thank you so much to the Muscular Dystrophy of Canada and for all of you for joining us. When we were thinking about parenting, parental stress, and chronic illness, we were thinking about beginning the story back when people were still single. And all of us come from a family. We come from a family of origin, and we are shaped by those early experiences. The way that we grew up in our family with religion, how finances were managed, culture, discipline practices, the traditions that our family created, and the way that we celebrate affect us as individuals. And these internalized experiences from our own childhood shape the type of parent that we go on to become. It's very interesting because often what happens, people have such a positive experience in their childhood that they want to imitate that experience, or some people have more difficult experiences and their goal as a parent is to do something very different or opposite from the way that they were raised. An example would be someone who grew up in a home where maybe there was scarcity and things were very difficult, and their goal as a parent is to make sure that they provide absolutely everything for their child. Or sometimes people may grow up in a situation where one parent is not present and they absolutely dedicate themselves to make sure that they're always there, even if the child is at a stage where maybe they need to be moving into being sort of an individual or separating. So I think I'm going to let Mary talk about this next part.
You can finish your thought if there is something there.
No, it's good.
So just thinking about the exciting time when you're expecting a child, there's so many hopes, there's so many dreams that people carry with them. And it's very normal to kind of create this mental path that you expect your child to go down. And there are many opportunities, many memories that you're hoping for and you're planning for. And when illness enters the picture, it can put a lot of things into question. And we can be understandably fearful around what obstacles might be in my child's way that I wasn't anticipating. We all anticipate, we know that life isn't perfect. There are obstacles, but the weight of trying to imagine a future different than what you had expected for your child is significant. And it comes at this time where people are expecting to experience a lot of joy, right? A baby brings joy to our lives. So there can almost be this sense of a disenfranchised grief. So, do I have the permission to grieve? Is it okay to grieve and express feelings of sadness or loss while also welcoming a new child into this world, and being excited and feeling grateful and joyful? And in our work, working with so many families that come through sick kids, we really feel that allowing space and time to honor feelings of grief and loss is really important. Sometimes I say it's almost like there's a boiling pot of water, and if you put a lid on it, eventually, you know, the water's going to spill over, and you don't really have control over kind of where that water goes. So it's better to kind of take the lid off sometimes, or put the lid to the side, so that these feelings can come out in hopefully some healthier ways, and we can acknowledge the fear and the grief that we may be experiencing. So we really wanted to acknowledge that whenever a diagnosis comes, it can really feel like all of a sudden a flood of emotion, right? You see the water in this image. It can feel like the rug's been pulled from under you and there is stable ground to stand on. And part of our work is supporting families with how do you live with uncertainty? We all kind of expect that we can know what our life is going to look like from day to day. And illness brings an awareness of the uncertainty of life that is quite profound. And part of our work is helping parents find their footing, standing on maybe some new ground in that as they continue. So go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, Mary, that, you know, when I think about the stress that comes with a new diagnosis or having a baby, or, you know, for kids who are diagnosed later with neuromuscular disorders, that opportunity for connection and to reach out, how important that is and how protective.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So I think that we chose this slide because I think the two penguins, the parent penguins facing toward one another, really shows that when a family is created, how important it is for the parents to turn toward one another. And in the space of that turning, they create the space for the child, and they create sort of the protective environment that kids need to flourish. We know that the better the parental relationship, the benefits to the child are significant. And we also know that when parents can support one another, the stress, whether that's learning how to care for a child who never has any hospital experiences and who is well, or a child who does have hospital experiences, is extremely important.
Absolutely. Just think of March of the Penguins and how significant the obstacles those parents were facing. It requires a real strong partnership. And now we're going to kind of reflect on what supports that partnership and what can actually put it at risk.
So John and Julie Gottman, they are a married couple, and John is actually a researcher and Julie is a clinical psychologist. And over the past number of decades, they have had what they call sort of like a love lab, where they've had many, many couples, some couples at the beginning of the relationship, some who've been married for some time, or some who've been married for decades. And what they've done is they've filmed them. And in the filming, they've seen that there are factors which are very protective in relationships, and there's factors which are really high risk for divorce and for sort of breaking that bond. And if you look on the left side of this slide, you'll see criticism where people like verbally attack the personality or character of their partner, contempt where it really is extremely insulting and abusive, defensiveness where people sort of don't take responsibility for their role in the interaction, and stonewalling, which may look like somebody's actually shutting down or like maybe they're not interested, but they're actually sort of retreating. And of these four, what the work of the Gottmans has identified is that contempt is really the highest risk for divorce. Often when families meet us in the hospital setting and they have a child with chronic illness, they ask if the stress of caring and the sort of the deep caregiving that they provide is going to put their relationship at greater risk for separation or divorce. And thanks to this work, what we can say is that couples who are at risk before having caregiving responsibility, they continue to be at risk. But couples who have these characteristics on the right-hand side, these things where they take responsibility, they have a culture of appreciation. And what that means is that for every negative comment, they have 5 positive comments. Or when they go to discuss something that's very difficult, they have what they call a gentle startup. So they use I statements. So instead of things like, when you leave your laundry on the floor, they say things, honey, I really love you. And I get upset when I see laundry on the floor. And we find that that's a much more successful strategy. And then for the antidote to the stonewalling is around being able to recognize when you need space and time to care for yourself, to be able to come back and engage. So we have the good news is that couples who have these strategies on the right-hand side can absolutely weather the storm of a diagnosis, contact with healthcare, the challenges of navigating rehabilitation services, and really help create that strong relationship that is so protective for children and contributes to children building healthy brain architecture.
Yes, and if I could add, these 4 things on the right-hand side can be learned. They can be worked on. So we also would encourage kind of reflection on that and being appreciative of what different caregivers, different parents bring to the table. We have different roles, we have different strengths, and if we can really foster that culture of appreciation, it goes a really long way, as well as the other antidotes. So, well, I'll look at all the babies, Kathy.
Yes, absolutely, Mary. I have to say, I quite, when we were putting these slides together, I really quite enjoy seeing all these pictures. So I think at this part, we're going to talk a little bit about the attunement between parents and infants, and parents and children and youth in general. What we know is that parenting has many challenges and many rewards, and that protective parenting can actually change a child's nervous system. Parents who can respond to their child, who recognize what their child is thinking and feeling, and that they can be accurate maybe about 75% of the time, these kids have more neural connections, they're able to regulate themselves better, they're able to sort of overcome adversity better. And we see that kids who have this type of secure parenting have sort of fewer infections, they have better health, they have better academic performance, and the quality of the parenting really makes a difference in terms of childhood resiliency.
So as a parent, it's pretty common to be questioning ourselves and asking, am I getting it right? Am I a good parent? And that brings up this concept of the good enough parent. And it's a really important concept. So some of what we're talking about now is, attachment. And this idea comes out of attachment, and it's saying that 75% idea. It's not never making a mistake. Mistakes will happen. It's for the most part, showing up and being there and tuning into your child and responding to their needs as best you can. And if a mistake happens, reminding ourselves that we can repair and we can reconnect. So when we're thinking about parenting, it's really trying to focus on building a secure base is one of the ways it's referred to. That foundation of connection, the strength of that relationship really provides the foundation to build a healthy family. And as Kathy was saying, has many positive effects into adulthood. So really some of these core questions that a program like Circle of Security, and there are other programs out there around these important topics, focus on is, am I connected to my child? And does my child feel safe and secure in my presence? Again, for the most part. And now we'll talk a little bit more about thinking about parenting styles.
So I think parenting styles can be seen as sort of being across a spectrum. And normally, parents use a variety of strategies, but when people are under stress, they tend to become more rigid in the style that they're using. Of these ones here from Barbara Colaroso's work, Kids Are Worth It, there's sort of the two extremes. The one extreme is what she calls the brick wall parent. This is the parent who is authoritarian. Do what I say when I say it. There's not a lot of opportunity for discussion and reflection. It's really quite sort of like very rigid and strict. Rules are absolute. There's no negotiation. There's not a lot of movement back and forth between the parent and child. Versus on the other end of the spectrum, which is the jellyfish parent, where this is a very loving parent, but rules can sometimes be an issue. Limits can be a challenge. These are parents where anything goes, there's no structure or guidelines. And then somewhere in the middle is what we call the backbone parent, or the authoritative parent. This is a parent who has both the limits setting and this unconditional love and acceptance. And they have sort of the full package and can put them both together. So we see that kids who have this style of responsive parenting, where there's some negotiation, there's this emotional connection, but there's also really clear rules that help the child feel safe. Kids who have this style of parenting, regardless of whether they have an illness or they don't have a chronic illness, this is the style that gives kids sort of the best secure base.
Absolutely.
So moving sort of along, this is actually a quote from Dr. Peter Rosenbaum that I actually have taped on my desk at work. And the idea of function, family, fun, friendships, and fitness in the context of future is a way that Dr. Rosenbaum from Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital here in Ontario has talked about looking at children who have medical or developmental complexity and really thinking about creating the biggest life and really the greatest opportunity. So every time I come to work, I take a look at this, and it, I think, sort of helps sort of center me in terms of dreaming big and really thinking about how to help families parent, manage stress, and think about wellness and resiliency.
I remember you saying that you've learned a lot from some of the photos you would see, Kathy. I thought that was quite touching, if you could share about that.
Yeah, I think in the work that I've done in the complex care program, where we care for children with medical complexity and fragility, I think it's really the families, Mary, that have taught me to dream big and to think much bigger than you know, when I see them in clinic or I see them in the hospital setting. Families have sent pictures over the years of being on vacation, or the kind of things that they do outside of the hospital. So that could be, you know, a week at Easter Seals camp where all of the kids are playing wheelchair basketball, even the Well siblings. It could be pictures of kids on wishes. It could be photos one family shared a picture of their child who is in a wheelchair, but was showing cows in competitions. So I think families are the ones who've really taught me to think big in terms of what's possible.
It's such an invitation for all of us. Thank you, Kathy. And now we're going to just think a little bit about the developmental phases of a child. So we started with pregnancy into infancy. And as we know, there are multiple stages of development, and each stage has a different focus. And it's really this process of learning and growing. And one of the things that we think of is that need to, again, it's kind of like a balance thing. Balance that urge to protect and shelter. And I would say if you have a child with an illness, most likely your instinct to protect and shelter has been activated and is quite strong. So then there's this challenge to sit back and allow your child to step forward and try some things out as they grow. And perhaps they may fumble. Perhaps they may fall. Perhaps they may fail at what they're trying. And the challenge for all parents is, how do you sit with that discomfort and then be ready for when they come to you, to be that soft place to land, to perhaps provide an opportunity to support them. And maybe a little bit of soothing might be needed, or maybe eventually some coaching, but to have belief in them that they can get back up. And as they see in your eyes that belief in their own capacity and that you're there for them no matter what, even if they fail, even if it's a really hard day, they will get back up and they will try again. And I think that goes, quite far into the teen years, which we'll talk about later as well.
So for siblings, we do not have any literature that's specific to neuromuscular diseases. The literature that we have is really from the chronic illness populations. And what we know is that siblings are sometimes in a very busy family. Sometimes it's hard to have the same focus and attention. And often families will ask Mary and I, how do siblings do? Are they okay? Do they get through childhood and go on to have successful lives? And what we know is that siblings who have a brother or sister that have chronic illness, there may be sometimes more anxiety. These are kids who sometimes have more contact with healthcare, and there may be sometimes emergencies that siblings may see and witness. But what we know is that these are kids who tend to be more mature than their peers. They tend to do quite well. And in fact, we've seen that a lot of siblings, more than sort of in the general population, tend to go into healthcare careers. So the part of being a brother or a sister of a sibling who has a health issue, it can actually be really beneficial and create lots of opportunity if these kids also get the same sort of, like attention around the parenting, the same sensitive parenting that we're talking about for the child with the medical needs.
Something I think about on this topic is the making an effort to give space for these siblings to be kids themselves and to have fun and also to explore and figure out who they are, so that they can take a break from that caregiving, big brother, big sister role. We want to honor that role. And I know there's, sometimes there are sibling days for certain clinics at the hospital. I think it's a role to honor, absolutely. And at the same time, we want to balance creating some space for them to follow their own path, to explore their own interests, and to, play and enjoy life and not always hold that heavy responsibility. So that can be so pressing. Does that make sense to you, Kathy?
Yeah, I think so, Mary. I think it's that balance, right? They're really important in sort of being caregivers and spending time with their brother or sister, and yet they also need that time away to be individuals and to sort of explore their own interests and passions. So we were thinking a little bit about sort of times of stress on the family, and absolutely the time of diagnosis can be very challenging. But another time is when kids start to go to school. And there's so much work that goes into meeting with the principal and speaking with home care and making sure they have the right resources and equipment, and maybe even having a psychoeducational assessment. It's also very stressful because for many families, this is the first time that the child is leaving the home and going into the community and creating sort of a community with peers. There's worries about bullying and how will the child be accepted. And what we see is that this is usually a bit of an adjustment phase, and that when the family can turn toward their own supports, when they can identify these things and speak about it, when they have the right resources and supports, this can actually go quite well. And we see a huge opportunity for growth and development.
Yes, and you know what I was thinking about when we were talking about the illness experience around maybe initially first diagnosis, or if there's a lot of experience in health in the hospital, that initial adjustment involves this learning phase around how do I advocate for my child? How do I build relationships with healthcare providers that support my child's best interest? And it's a learning process. You know, it's again kind of figuring out what works. And those skills are really valuable to carry into this adjustment. If you've learned skills around advocating within systems, if you've learned how to build, you know, kind of a relationship, a partnership with providers, that can be transferred to working with the teacher or the EA, because having that really having strong communication and a good basis of understanding and a good relationship ultimately with those key people in the school can be so vital and so important.
I think, Mary, that the piece as well is around parents now having a larger team.
Yeah.
Sometimes parents in those early days talk about having to be the occupational therapist or the physiotherapist, the speech path, the nurse. And now when kids go to school, there's a whole new team, but that parenting role is so central and so critical for the child's success.
They only have one mom, they only have one dad, they only have one grandma, whomever their primary caregiver is, that, you know, that person is their world. Their parents are often just really at the heart of these children. And I know it can seem, especially as they get older, that, oh, parents are annoying. They're still critically important. They're still central, right? If we think of the foundation, they're kind of like the center columns. And yeah, reminding ourselves that, yes, I might do nursing tasks. I might do respiratory therapy. I might do some occupational therapy with my child, but I am their mother, for example, first. And that is the most important of all of the roles, and the central one. I think is a really valuable thing to say. Yeah.
So we were also thinking that in some neuromuscular conditions, as kids get older, they may need additional supports. And you may have had a time of sort of stability, and there may be new technology that comes, whether that might be non-invasive ventilation like BiPAP or CPAP overnight. It might be moving from a walker to a wheelchair. And what we see is that every time there's more technology added, this can be a time of new stress for a family. Things like respite, whether that's in-home respite or out-of-home respite, really building the support team, really having the right people that can support the family. These are all things that can kind of foster resiliency and help the family with coping with these new technologies.
So we're talking about some of the challenging milestones in a way, right? So entering the teen years definitely is a time that is challenging. And for some families, those challenges start in the preteen years and they only kind of increase in intensity in the actual teen years. And there's a lot to kind of consider about this time, right? So it's often said, okay, they got the raging hormones, but we know it's more than that. There's actually a pruning going on in the brain, and the brain is changing. It's preparing for the last phase of development where it's going to kind of keep what neural connections that's most valuable to that child. So that you'll see a lot of emotional expression, emotional reactivity. We're going to see more risk-taking behavior, impulsivity, thrill-seeking, and that's actually all typical and part of this process of the teen going into development, going towards adulthood. It brings a lot of challenges for parents, absolutely. And often what we find in our work with families is the style of parenting that worked when they were younger doesn't really work so well in the teen years. So if your style was more directive, or your child was really just listening to listening to what you said and doing what you said, all of a sudden that might be not the case. And the directive style may not be working well. And so it's really a time to think about what will work and what is my role now as a parent when my young person, my child, is on this journey. It's a journey of self-exploration. They have to figure out who they are, right? And part of that is separating from you as parents and separating from the family partially. They have to see, who am I in the world? Where do I fit in? Peer groups take on an importance. They want to belong. That's a human need we all have. And they might try on different things and different ways of being to trying to find that belonging. When you have an illness, though, or a physical difference, or both, belonging can be more challenging. And finding peers that are supportive can be challenging. Bullying is something absolutely that comes up as a concern for many parents when they're thinking about school years, and it can continue into the teen years. Something that Kathy and I felt was really important to say when we're thinking about peers, when we're thinking about my child and the social world, as a parent, we invite you to think of quality over quantity. The research shows that having even just one strong, in your life friend has great benefits. It's really a protective factor. So it's not about necessarily having, a big number of friends. That's not what is shown to be so important. It's that quality and having that good friend. Now, I said this idea of, pushing away from the parents. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're clear, you still matter a lot as a parent. It's just your role has changed, and it's more the sit back, okay, no, let the kid know I'm there for them, and seeing if they need to turn to me when there are troubled times or when they're managing something that's hard for them to manage. But they're going to try to do more on their own. And when we're thinking of that push kind of in this phase, Kathy and I were talking a little bit about swimming, actually.
Well, I think, Mary, like the idea of adolescence is the push and the pull, right? And I think when a child has needed, support from a parent, it's a really difficult task for parents to give kids that space and to trust that they're going to be okay. But I think when we were talking about sort of swimming, we were thinking about, swimmers, and how when you get to the end of the pool, you do the flip turn and you push off, you push out into the pool, which is kind of like pushing into adult life. And the parents are actually the wall. And I think that the parents are critical to be able to have the good push, like the secure base. But sometimes when you're the wall, it doesn't feel very good.
No, no, no. So yeah, knowing that it's serving a purpose hopefully can help.
Yep. And then I just wanted to add that the other task, I think, for teens is this piece around the transition to adult care and the importance of teenagers being able to take on some of that health advocacy themselves. The really excellent work that their parents have done, you know, coordinating their appointments, speaking with all of the physicians, the orthotist or the speech path or whomever. It is so critical for teenagers to be able to develop these skills so that they can be as independent as possible or even fully independent in the adult healthcare system.
Yes, yeah, it's a big transition, and the more comfort, familiarity, and then practice of using the skills, the better. So we, depending on the clinic, they might start trying to, meet with your child just on their own, even in preteens and definitely into the teens. We want to kind of protect that time for them to be on their own with the healthcare providers, really to strengthen what we were just talking about, those skills. So another concept that we wanted to share with you is called the window of tolerance. And it comes out of understanding how our nervous system is impacted by stress, as well as some of the work done in the research around mindfulness. So in the window of tolerance, we can handle things. We're doing okay. Smooth sailing, as the slide says. And when we're in that place, we can connect to others, we can problem solve, we can think clearly, and we're typically calm. However, that we don't spend our whole lives in that window of tolerance. We can move up or down when we're out of that window. And moving up means going into a hyper arousal state where you may see anger, you may see racing thoughts, anxiety, feelings of panic even. Okay, so it's saying this is too much, and your mind starts spinning, or you might be slamming doors and yelling. Okay, now if you go down, you are going into a hypoarousal state, and that comes with kind of a shutdown or a numbing and withdrawing. You might hear responses like, doesn't matter, whatever, okay, or the person kind of seems to be kind of hiding away. In the context of illness or other types of trauma or persistent stress, what can happen is, instead of kind of the sailboat being in the window of tolerance, going out, up and down, and coming back in, that we can kind of get stuck on maybe the hyperarousal side, or we get stuck on the hypoarousal side. So getting stuck in a hyperarousal kind of place is when we see hypervigilance. So that, when is the next shoe going to drop? I always need to be on, surveilling for danger, that sense that you need to kind of overfunction. And then the other thing is the hypoarousal, where we're stuck on kind of a withdrawal reaction. And that can kind of look like the person doesn't really care, but it's not necessarily so. It could be that they care so much but feel helpless that they kind of get into this stuck way of thinking. I'm better off just shutting down because this is overwhelming. We want to think, we'll talk about toxic stress, but we want to think about how do we get back in our window and what works for us to get back in our window. And that's going to be different for everyone. And another consideration is, does it make sense to try to have meaningful conversations when someone's outside of their window of tolerance? No. So
sorry, Mary, I was just going to say that I think when I think about parenting and best parenting, You know, when we are hyper aroused above our place, or when we're hypo and we're below, those are really not good. Those are difficult places to parent from, and we have to be in our window. And I think for kids, when they're over or under aroused, they can't hear the parenting. So it's kind of matching the parent window and the kid window so that everybody's in their window of tolerance to be able to have the greatest impact.
Absolutely. All right.
Okay, so we were thinking about stress, and I think that in you know, in sort of our society, stress is sort of a bad rap. Stress can actually be positive or it can be negative. And positive stress is actually essential for us to have growth and to develop. Positive stress would be things like, you know, they something that you need to be able to develop to progress. It can teach us motivation, resiliency, and these are usually infrequent, brief, mild stressors that we can be successful at, and that we you know, get a little bit stressed, but then we come back very quickly. There's also something called tolerable stress. This is something that is sort of more severe and sustained. And what happens is that our neuroendocrine immune system releases hormones. And what happens is that we sort of go up, and it takes longer for things to come down. An example of a tolerable stress would be like a death in the family, or maybe a divorce. And then we get to toxic stress. Toxic stresses are really stresses that are prolonged, they're persistent, and they're really severe. They're high intensity. Things that are examples of toxic stress would be things like abuse, neglect in childhood, violence, extreme poverty. And what we see is that when there is toxic stress, the body produces really high levels of cortisol, a stress hormone. And we also have like inflammation in our body. So it affects us not just emotionally, it also affects us physically. And when children experience toxic stress, it can have effects into adulthood. What we do know, though, is that having good supports, being able to turn towards someone, having really loving parental relationships that are responsive, these are highly protective. Having one teacher that is responsive can also be very protective. And we know that when parents are in situations where they experience toxic stress, it can affect their mental health and their physical health. And that in turn can affect the health and well-being of children. This is an article that was in the Archives of Disease. It's actually fairly recent. It's only about a year old. And Dr. Rotberg is one of the psychiatry fellows who was at Sick Kids. And this is an article that talks about the importance of pediatricians in identifying stress in caregivers of children who have medical needs. That talks about sort of the importance of sort of a two-generation pediatric approach model. And what they say is that the best way to help children is to help their parents, and the best way to reach parents is through their children. And what we know is that parents who have very high levels of stress, they're at really high risk of things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we see when you have a child with chronic illness. And in some cases, there's even high rates of cardiac disease and maybe even mortality. So the idea of the article is that it's really important to identify parents who need additional supports, managing children with high caregiving needs, and that the pediatrician may be a place to kind of get some help early, and the importance of early referral and being supported with mental health supports to try and stave off these really difficult sort of outcomes with toxic stress.
So we want to talk a little bit more about what can be protective against things like toxic stress and help us cope with difficulty. And Kathy already mentioned connection. It can also come from community and our close relationships, but also self-care practices. I know it's talked about a lot, but it really is the foundation for our health, right? Things like sleep and fitness. And when we give to ourselves, it helps support that strong base of the family, right? When a parent is well cared for. Also, meaning making, right? Having that meaningful, full life we talked about. And then mental flexibility, being able to think of things in a way that allows us to see hope. So this is a resource list, some of the books Kathy and I recommend, as well as a place where you can find more information around healthcare contacts with your children. And I know we want to save some time for questions. Anything you wanted to add around the resources, Kathy?
No, I think that these are, two of these are by Dr. Dan Siegel. The Whole Brain Child is one that I absolutely like to use with school-age kids. It actually teaches about the brain and sort of the stress, the fight-flight response. And it teaches kids language around when their upstairs brain and their downstairs brain aren't communicating. And I really enjoy that very much. And then Brainstorm is actually another book by Dr. Siegel that talks about the adolescent brain. And like you were saying, Mary, the brain is being pruned, but there's reduced dopamine, which actually leads to some of their sort of risk-taking behaviors. And it's written both for parents and for teenagers to read.
Yeah, and some classics there. But I guess we want to open it up to questions in the last bit of time that we have. So thanks for listening. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mary and Kathy. It's been really nice to receive this evidence-based information, but in a way that we can all understand and relate it to individuals who are impacted by neuromuscular disorders. As Mary just mentioned, it is time for questions. If you have any, I did receive a question privately that I'd like to share with you. The question is, someone had mentioned the mother first, or you're thinking about yourself as a mother first. But when during the COVID-19 pandemic hit, parents are now taking on the role of personal support worker, teacher. They're working from home, so it's difficult to put on that mother first cap on. So any tips of how to manage the pandemic, where a lot of families impacted by neuromuscular disorders, especially ones that didn't want night nurses in their home, or PSWs who were being shared by long-term care facilities, they took on so much more than before. Any tips for how to manage all those roles during the pandemic?
I think that the question around COVID-19 is very timely. I think so many families that were like coping really well have been really impacted by the pandemic. And as one of my colleagues had mentioned, this is sort of like the first time in her career where she's going through the same thing as families. But I think when you're talking about neuromuscular disorders, not having that nursing, not having the sleep, not having the support is absolutely a huge challenge. And, what I have seen some of our families do is try and have more sort of Zoom calls, FaceTime, phoning people. But one way of kind of recentering in such a busy existence, right? When I think about children or teens who have very high care needs, that could be like 16 hours a day sometimes. We've talked a lot about mindfulness. And what we've seen is the relaxation response can actually calm the sympathetic nervous system and can give your mind a bit of a rest, even if you're still physically very busy. And we have spoken with parents, and we do something where, even during these caregiving responsibilities or something simple like doing dishes, we'll ask parents to kind of immerse themselves in the experience. and really use their senses. What do they see? What do they hear? What are they touching? What do they smell? What do they taste? And that sort of triggers this relaxation response that Herbert Benson first spoke about, that can kind of calm the nervous system, even though families are under more stress than they've ever been before.
Yeah, I wanted to add that, caring for yourself first is not always possible.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if first is always a fair kind of expectation. There are realities, there are healthcare needs, there are, infant needs that do kind of sometimes take precedent. Um, and in the context of COVID-19, we are adding to unpaid labor, and we are adding stress, and it's unrealistic. You cannot teach your child the way the teacher can, right? It's a different relationship. You're their parent. And we can't be full-time workers and full-time parents managing it all in one room, or right, like, and give as much as we used to give to work, for example. We do, I think, need to adjust our expectations of ourselves. Actually, some of the healthcare um, providers were speaking up against, there's more screen time now, and having a bit more screen time now is to be expected, and um, trying to help parents manage all the kind of guilt and stress that they're under in these very demanding times. And I would agree with Kathy. Anything we can do to help our body regulate, whether it's a cup of tea, like some small, simple moments, or progressive muscle relaxation. If you can't get out to exercise, tensing all of your muscles as much as you can, and then releasing them with a big exhale, things like that can be helpful. Any other questions?
Oh, that's great. Another question that came in was around siblings. First, they wanted to thank you for acknowledging siblings in your presentation. This is a family affected by a neuromuscular condition, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they were saying, well, what are the tangible tips? How do I make sure that I give my daughter, who doesn't have a neuromuscular condition, the right amount of attention and resources? And one thing that they also added is, having a child affected by a neuromuscular condition, it costs a lot to the family. So that has spared the other child from opportunities. So, for example, ballet. What are your thoughts on what does that look like? Giving the full attention, giving the sibling the right resources.
I think that is such a thoughtful question, and my suspicion is that this is probably a parent who's already doing the right things because they're asking the right questions. But I think that piece around being present, of really listening carefully, that physical contact, even if it can't be as much as you want it to be, but to be fully there when you are there. Not to be distracted, even if it's only a few minutes in a day. That emotional responsiveness, the modeling that you can feel however you want to feel, and sort of teaching kids how to manage that and to regulate. And then I think sort of like opportunities outside of the house. So I fully appreciate it is extremely expensive trying to manage neuromuscular conditions, and not everything is funded, for sure. But even things like, being able to do things through the school, which again, during the pandemic is not really possible. But if there are teams at school or opportunities through school, if there's online opportunities that might be free, peer groups, just really giving kids sort of that time and that attention to say whatever's exciting to them. So that could be reading with a young kid, even if it's only 10, 15 minutes a day. It could be checking in about homework. It could be, watching a favorite TV show together, eating a meal together. Even those small points of contact are going to create the secure base.
Yes. And I would add that different children have different needs, and you're always balancing the different needs in the home. And that is a hard job as a parent. And that being said, there might be a time when the sibling needs more, and you will recalibrate to try to meet that need. And this idea of fair and equal can come up. Life's not fair, and we know that, and it can't be equal amongst all siblings. But there's an idea around equity, which is trying to get people what they need to be able to do what they can. And it may not be ballet because of the expenses, but can there be other ways to explore maybe music or different types of expression? So kind of saying, okay, this may not be an option, but what options that can meet similar needs might be available, as Kathy was saying, maybe from the public library system or school, or some things that are low cost or free.
Thank you so much, Mary and Kathy. The presentation, like I said, was very clear and held a lot of great information. I'm already seeing some comments where people are really appreciating the information that you've shared. I wanted to encourage those that are on this webinar that there is a roundtable next for parents who have children or youth with neuromuscular disorders. Thank you again, Kathy and Mary, for an excellent presentation, and for all of you for joining today. Have a good rest of your afternoon.